you think spread? Well, as it turns out, we found 3 of them spread: Pulp Fiction, Love Actually, and Good Will Hunting. And we found a particularly interesting difference between the Pulp Fiction fans and the Love Actually fans. And before I show the picture, I want you to ask a question. What part of the network do you think the Pulp Fiction fans sit in compared to the Love Actually fans? Well, as it turns out, the Pulp Fiction fans are in the center, and the Love Actually fans are on the edges. And again, another lesson for social marketers. You think you want to find the Breck girl, and you want the Breck girl to be in the center of the network because then everybody is going to love your product. But if your product was Love Actually and you started hitting the center of the network, you would have failed. Because there are some things that don't just spread throughout the network. The structure of the network itself has an impact on what is going to spread and where it's going to spread. Now, an interesting contrast to both of these is the taste in books. And so here are the top 10 authors listed in our group of people on Facebook. And the ones here that spread are just 2, Salinger and Shakespeare. And what we found here was that there wasn't any consistent pattern.
We hope we spread too, by the way, but we're not sure about that.
Yeah, we might make it to the top 1,000.
But we don't resemble Salinger and Shakespeare last, so we don't know.
Yes, we're still alive.
Yes.
But we didn't find any kind of structure here. We didn't find center, periphery. We didn't find diffuse, internal, anything that would resemble some kind of group structure. That's the way we did for music and for movies. And the way we explain this is that books aren't really about shared identity. You don't sit down and read a book with somebody else. But you'll listen to music with somebody else, you go to the movies with somebody. Those activities are explicitly social activities, and so what we expect then is that these contagions are going to be more contained within groups and more structured than taste in books. And again, that suggests that there are going to be some things that you can target certain parts of the network for in terms of marketing, and some things that you're not going to be able to do the same kind of thing for. So now, enormity obviously is one way that the online world is different, but we also thought of 3 other things that are important besides enormity. One is communality. And the best example of our communal impulse and how that really gets magnified in these large networks is Wikipedia. So think about the Sarah Palin page during the last election. At its peak, it was getting 1,000 edits a day. And so you can imagine, Wikipedia is just like this blank wall with a bunch of spray cans that anyone can go up and spray anything they want on the wall. You would expect that the outcome of that process is just going to be a big Jackson Pollock, right? It's just going to be a big, although, Jackson Pollock probably, I don't want to offend any Jackson Pollock fans, but it's going to be something that doesn't have a lot of structure to it. But in fact, what we find on Wikipedia is that there are people who take responsibility for the outcome of a certain page. And they enforce POV, point of view, on Wikipedia. So that what you found during the election was that someone would come in and say something really, really positive and untrue about Sarah Palin, and it would get taken down. Another person would come up and say something really negative and untrue about Sarah Palin, and it would get taken down. And if you looked at any one point in time, the entry was actually remarkably balanced as a result of these altruistic efforts by people who are combined in this massive social network online. And so these communal resources really I think are going to be one way that we're going to be experiencing a different kind of life, one way that our natural social networks really don't necessarily function already. Specificity is another thing that's going to get amplified online. We already tend to look for people who are like us, right? But this is much easier to do online. And so, for example, this is a lovely map by Letta Adamic of the political blogosphere in the United States. And there was all of this talk about how the internet was going to democratize our discourse and allow us to have access to diverse points of view. And each one of these lines now is a link from one blog to another. You've got blue are the liberals and red are the conservatives. And how much discourse is going on here? These nodes are being placed near the ones that they tend to link. All the liberals are tending to link to all the liberals, and all the conservatives are tending to link to all the conservatives. And you have some links in between, but the vast majority of the links are to people who already have the same point of view. And so, on the one hand, this could be a really bad thing, right? Because it might accentuate the polarization, the political polarization, like we talk about in the book, that we've already experienced over the last 20 or 30 years. On the other hand, the ability to find people like you can be really helpful in terms of, say, finding a mate. Or if, for example, you have a rare disease, you might be able to find someone else with that rare disease and get support from that person in a way that you wouldn't have been able to do before because you wouldn't have known that that person even existed. And we have some nice stories in the book about people who actually find these other people and are able to really get more information about how to treat the disease and also how to cope with the disease over time. And so this increasing specificity is going to be a double-edged sword as we take our natural social networks online. The last thing that's really different is this idea of virtuality. Okay, and so you might, for example, go on to Second Life and create a character like this, but in real life, you might look like this. Now, you might not only have different images, but you also might have different personalities online and offline. And one very interesting thing that we talk about in the book is that psychologists are actually starting to use this to study behavior. And so, for example, there was a recent experiment by Stanford psychologists in which people were asked to play a bargaining game. And in this bargaining game, what they did to people is they randomly assigned them avatars that were taller or shorter. And what they found was that online, that the people who are randomly assigned these tall avatars, they tend to ask for more in the negotiation, and the other person tended to give them more in the negotiation. So this is the first time psychologists have ever been able to do this. You know, psychologists can't walk up to you and say, I'm going to make you look like Chuck Norris now and see what happens to you, right? And so one really cool outcome about this is that social science will never, ever be the same. We're going to be able to do so much because it looks like we're able to actually manipulate people's behavior just by changing their identities online. But the other thing that's really important is that what this means is that we actually have different identities online, and they influence our behavior. It appears that we actually behave differently online than we do in real life. And so we think that we're going to be taking our natural social networks online, but we're also going to be creating these identities from scratch online that will have their own rules. And it's going to be very interesting to see, how these rules unfold in the coming years.
So I'm just going to close with a couple of remarks. We're going to close with a couple of remarks about sort of big picture ideas, and then we can take some questions. We got some unclear guides as to how long we have to go, but we'll just take a couple more minutes and then we'll do some questions. So, I think one of the ways that we see the science of social networks advancing social science actually in philosophical thinking about human social systems in general is the following. If you think about sort of 18th century perspectives on understanding collective identity and group behavior, the imagination was that you had a series of isolated individuals, and the canonical example, of course, is Adam Smith, each individual acting in the furtherance of his or her own interests, as if by an invisible hand is guided to create, let's say, an efficient market, which is a collective property of the group, right? So you have individuals that are isolated, and you get a group by the virtue of actions of individuals. And partly in reaction to that, in the 19th century, you had scholars like Karl Marx and Emil Durkheim who said, no, really, to understand social systems, you need to understand groups as a whole. Forget about the individual. So you have the proletariat, you've got the bourgeoisie, you've got the nobility. Each of them can be understood as having their own identity, even their own consciousness, their own will. These groups act independent of the individuals. Emil Durkheim talks about suicide rates being constant in a given religion in France over 100 years, even though the individuals have come and gone. And this relates to a very old philosophical problem known as the family knife. The family knife problem is 100 years ago, your family had a knife, a very special knife. And then 90 years ago, the blade broke off and the blade was replaced. And then 80 years ago, the handle broke off and you got a new handle. And then 70 years ago, a new blade, and then 60 years ago, a new handle, up until the present day, and you still think of it as the same knife. This is our family knife. This is Grandpa's axe, even though the handle and the head of the axe have been changed countless times. It has an identity that transcends the components. And so this is the same kind of argument that these scholars are making. These groups have an identity that transcends the component individuals. But then in the 20th century, there was a kind of an increased desire to study individuals as members of groups or as members of classes. So here the argument is each of these people might be black or white, rich or poor, and their membership in these groups then confers certain likelihood that they will act in a particular kind of a way. They have this kind of identity that influences their behavior. And in fact, a whole panoply of statistical and other conceptual methods were developed that took advantage of this, sort of ideas in game theory and in statistical estimation that exploited this basic perception. But we think in the 21st century there'll be a new way of understanding how individuals are nested within groups and how social systems come to be and act. And that is when we add the specific structural information of the ties between individuals. And that by adding the ties, we can begin to understand the emergence of groups, and we can begin to understand how it is that groups of individuals are greater than the sum of the parts. So we close the book with a set of arguments, which I'll just summarize right now, that we think speak to a set of philosophical questions that have been with us for hundreds of years. One is this question of the whole is great. How is it? How